edited in.
You'll have to say that later for the
Yeah, exactly. Several of the speakers started their talks by saying, by sort of positioning themselves as legitimate or not legitimate to talk about something by having seen the exhibition or not.
Mm.
Which, as an art historian, I found extremely interesting, that there would be this presumption that the document, I mean, as you train as an art historian, you end up working from documents all the time. I mean, your whole first sort of, I mean, this whole notion that you're dealing with slides rather than particular works of art, and when you've become a graduate student, you really start to be able to travel and look at works of art specifically in their context, institutional and otherwise, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I found it very interesting that there's this presumption that the archive of the exhibition is somehow transparent to our reading, either as a box of materials, and it's I think notoriously sort of known that there is no real archive for Magicien de la Terre that's accessible to a public, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the exhibition around which so much of the discussion turned in Utrecht.
Yeah, I remember.
Or the archive, or the exhibition as an experience. So you're dealing with these two particular objects of study, right? And and the question of which to privilege in this discussion about exhibitions already needs to be put on the table,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whether or not you are more legitimate because you've seen an exhibition,
Yeah.
and it's similar in a way to the kinds of discussion we had in the 90s in the United States in academia, where you were legitimate or not to talk about a particular problem based on your subject position.
Yeah.
So as a woman, I was allowed to talk about feminism, but as a man, you weren't, right? And that was the most sort of egregious, I don't know, vulgarity that we confronted when we were trying to think through post-structuralism. Right?
Yeah.
So you couldn't possibly speak for the position of the other.
Right.
Right. And I find that kind of thing is being, it's a danger that we're finding ourselves in when we start saying that we can or cannot talk about objects that we've seen, studied, or not seen. I mean, it also disenfranchises an entire portion of the population who might want to talk about things that they haven't necessarily seen in person, and as non-experts. And it also disenfranchises an entire segment of the population who can't travel to see exhibitions or presumes that there's one essential moment at which one needs to see those works. So Steve McQueen's work, if the question of migration is really important, it's also the migration of those works, the circulation of those works through different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're talking about Documenta 11, Musée d'Art Moderne La Ville de Paris did an exhibition with Steve McQueen when I was working there, in between 2001 and 2004. I can't remember if it was 2002 or 2003. And those works were works that were produced specifically for the exhibition. They had nothing to do with the kinds of issues that you find in Carib Sleep or Western Deep, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that, I mean, what that indicates to me is that we need to think about, in an art historical way, the objects that we're talking about in terms of a whole set of references rather than just one or two, or just the exhibition as the sole vector through which we can
Right.
gain access to things.
Yeah.
I mean, the exhibition is important. I mean, it's a paradigm that is undeniably dominant aujourd'hui. I'm slipping into French. Dominant today. But yeah.
That is too much noise. I'm sorry.
Is
Can
it?
you do that?
Are we going?
Yeah.
Can we do the outtakes?
The
bloopers.
Yeah, the bloopers. Yeah, I agree. I think there's a place for the experience of exhibitions, for sure, but also that shouldn't limit historical inquiry in terms of looking at documents whenever possible. And I think also, even if you haven't seen an exhibition, of course, I mean, even if you have seen an exhibition, there's still more to do, because you can never completely know or experience or fully be aware of what's at stake in an exhibition, I think. But returning to your other question, which I didn't answer, it's true my work has been focused on film photography and video, but I think these questions are also being addressed within other kinds of practices, installation and sculpture and performance, the whole project of socially engaged art, or that's come about. These are certainly important developments in the 90s, and others have written about them extensively. So there's a very interesting discourse. The whole development of so-called relational aesthetics and socially engaged practice, I think, is very interesting. Collectivism and new ways of bringing together an artistic and a political way of operating, I think, is an important development, as well as in relationship to collective projects like, at least in the States, 16 Beaver, these kind of very interesting platforms that relate in some ways to the development and formation of new institutionalism, the development of laboratories for discourse, where artistic practice is also it comes about, it's produced within discursive formations.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are all very important developments. And for me, also speaking as a curator, I've done a few projects. One that is currently on now at Nottingham Contemporary, called Uneven Geographies, Art and Globalization, which I co-curated with Alex Farquharson, the director. It was important to us, in fact, to disrupt the potential homogeneity of the image in relationship to video or photography that can occur in exhibitions that tend to give themselves over to this. And I think Document 11 was in a way, the height and the turning point in relationship to this. And I think for me, it is important to have, I think, ideally an exhibition that has some sense of material heterogeneity in it, so that there's we included sculpture as well as performative element, as well as two-dimensional painting and drawing works, in addition to photography and video. But, for example, a group of artists that I've recently come across that I find very interesting, and we included in the exhibition, is this Swedish pair of artists called Golden and Seneby, going by their last names. And they're very interesting, precisely for this question: how do you represent artistically life severed from politics?
They've been in residence in Paris for the past.
Yeah, of course they
for the past 6 months, and I went to see Looking for Headless at La Défense.
Ah, you do it.
And so I know their work,
right.
Actually, and I know some.
Right. Did you find the tree? Where?
No. I didn't go on the tour to the forest
okay.
because I was in Utrecht, but I did go on the. They held a screening in an office tower at La Défense. Called,
interesting.
A screening of the film Looking for Headless in one of those very alienating.
Yeah, of course. Office buildings.
Office buildings.
Yeah, but speaking of that, I mean, their whole inquiry into the history of Georges Bataille and Acéphale, certainly the figure of a headless person relates directly to this condition of being without representation that I'm very interested in multiple ways. It can mean many different things. It can be politically, it can signify political vulnerability, not having a voice, not having recognition. But it can also be a recourse to a kind of emancipatory freedom, to not be entrapped within the structures of identity, for example. So this plays out differently according to the artistic project that we're looking at. But their whole inquiry into the economics of the offshore banking specifically, relates directly to this whole recent development of globalization in a way that turns it on its head, in a sense, or removes the head at least, because for them they bring up the focus is not on the refugee, on the dispossessed, disenfranchised refugee. Of course, that's a complicated figure because, as you mentioned before, according to Agamben, it's not simply a matter of dispossession, it's also a potential politicization. That figure is a potential politicization for resisting the conditions of nationality and certain kinds of identity formations. That raises a lot of questions, but for Golden and Seneby, headlessness relates to the multinational corporation that exists without a command structure, that exists without national or financial regulatory oversight. And that relates directly to the developments of neoliberal globalization. And I think it's very interesting what they're trying to do, which as far as I understand it, and they never articulate it, but I think we as critics and historians have to think about this. But what they're trying to do is to borrow that logic of the offshore and to retrieve it for within the artistic realm in terms of the formation of a new kind of strategy of subject formation that resists, in a way, the representational fixity that has occurred at earlier moments of minority recognition or identity politics or documentary film and photography, and to turn that structure not into a mechanism of financial inequality or monopolizing resources, but instead as a process of artistic flexibility and potential political, developing political room for play, in a way.
So picking up the thread of what you were just saying about Golden and Seneby, one of the things that I find particularly interesting in the analyses that you've been making of work by artists like Emily Jessier and Steve McQueen and now Golden and Seneby is that there seems to be a concerted effort on your part to discuss the ways in which there's a coincidence between aesthetic form and the content that's being expressed. And this seems like a very kind of old-fashioned or modernist thing to say, but in some ways, it's also extremely contemporary, or it feels like it's extremely contemporary to me when an artist will attempt to use formal strategies that can in some way express the whole sort of ethos underlying the artistic production. So with Golden and Seneby, this idea that the project itself would be fragmentary, that they are never present, that you can't grasp the looking for headless project in its totality, that it's always going to sort of just be beyond grasp. And there are different ways in which artists, video artists or artists working with photography or film also try to make that manifest or formalize that in their work. That was just a sort of follow-up comment to what you were saying.
But of course, in the work of someone like Emily Jessier, it's a very different question, because I think it reveals, to think about Golden and Seneby and Emily Jessier together, is very strange in some ways, because in a way, Golden and Seneby are mimicking a structure of power that they have access to, in a way, easy access to as European men, in some ways, to bring back. I mean, we can't completely accept the negation of identity either, I think, today. And Emily is also...
No, I mean, as a market commodity, especially, which they absolutely display when they put their work looking for headless up for sale in an auction and speculation.
Yeah, and surely they're aware. Of this and are mobilizing it. And they're mobilizing their masculinity and Europeanness in a self-conscious way. But for Emily, of course, it's an interesting, a politically urgent one, but also conceptually provocative question of how to negotiate between the demands for national identity, in her case, for at least Palestinian self-determination, and the sensitivity to the representational demands to resist totalizing the subject through the image. So that for me is an interesting tension.
I want to shift the discussion slightly to talk about the discipline of art history. And one of the questions that that came to mind.